Hello, welcome to the Movement at the Citizen, our politics show that brings you political parties which come to offer you reasons why you should vote for them. Today we are joined by Zibi, the leader of Rise Mzansi. Of course, you would know it's a new political party that's wowing all South Africans with their new intrinsic policies and their young leadership. Mr. Zibi, good morning.
Good morning, and thank you very much for having me here at the Citizen.
Great stuff. Now, Mr. Zibi, let's get straight into it. What's your membership looking like?
So we don't do members, by the way. We've got volunteers, we've got organizers, volunteers, and then we've got what we call supporters. So we decided from the get-go to do what the ANC keeps calling better, fewer, but better. So you need people who are going to be activists, and the number of activists that we have is about 8,000 now, but we have over 300,000 supporters across all 9 provinces.
All right, that's great stuff. Now, Rise Mzansi comes at a time when South Africa is in a political dilemma with the future of coalitions. Do you see Rise Mzansi being in a possible coalition with anyone? And if so, who would you prefer being in coalition with?
Look, our number one priority is to get into parliament. That's how you end up in a in a coalition. So it's to get into parliament. And parliament on its own is very important because people need representatives that are going to fight for their issues in parliament. When budgets come up in committee, when all of these policy and other decisions are being debated and considered. So the South Africans need representatives. So for us, that's our number one priority. If, however, out of being in parliament, we get an opportunity to either help to form a coalition government or to vote for one, obviously we'll take up the opportunity. But we don't believe before the election is the time to start discussing coalitions because you need to get the votes, get the seats, and then have the coalitions discussion.
Of course, but is there a particular party that you would perhaps lean towards? Maybe someone who is more aligned to the policies that Rise Mzansi has?
No, I mean, I wouldn't call it one political party in particular. A couple of things. Principle number one is that it must be a group of political parties that are able to put their ideological differences aside. That's how coalitions work across the world. You do not necessarily go for political parties that agree with you. You go for political parties that can agree on a set of priorities, who is going to be in government, how the arrangement is going to work between you, and then you govern together because none of you got a majority. So that principle is important. The second principle is this. In the event that the ANC is booted out by the electorate, we would first consider forming a minority government, that is with other political parties, because voters would have decided they don't want to give the ANC a majority anymore. So that would be option 2. That would be the first option. The second option would be if it appeared that the ANC could form a government, but to do that, it would go into government with an absolutely irresponsible and unhelpful political party, then we would strongly consider, in the interests of South Africa, to get into a coalition with the ANC with conditions in place, particularly relating to fighting corruption.
Of course. Now, another issue is that you yourself are a former communicator, a former journalist. You've been criticized for entering the space of politics, especially by the EFF, who say, this is an editor who just came into politics and all of a sudden, this party's big. He's got posters everywhere. Where is he getting the money from?
Yes.
Do you have reasons why you left the media space and, what you used to do to get into this political space?
I've had a long career. I worked for Volkswagen for 8 years. That's motor industry. I worked in mining. I worked in journalism. I worked in banking. And I think it's important as a general rule that we avoid defining people by where they work, first of all, which is what the EFF appears to be doing. I think they think I was only a journalist. I wasn't. I've done many other things in my life. The biggest reason, and if you read my final column as editor of Business Day in February 2016, that will give you an indication that I knew already then, because my call to action then was that if South Africans do not stand up and try and defend the country, defend the democracy, make sure that the country becomes what it needs to be, then we are going to have a lot more poverty and suffering and just complete destruction of the country. You can only do so much by simply writing about a problem. At some point, the doing becomes necessary. And it's not odd, by the way. David Cameron, who's now the foreign minister in the UK, but was formerly prime minister, he was a journalist. Nobody complained that.
Helen Zille was a journalist.
Helen Zille was a journalist. I mean, all over the world, there are all of these examples of people who have been journalists before, but went into politics and did well.
Of course. And then, of course, there was the issue of funding, which was a bit more controversial. That, in fact, this is how they phrased it, that you're being funded by some Western powers for regime change. And I'm sure you did hear of this comment.
I did.
What did you think of it?
I laughed at it. It's silly. There are some reasons for it. First of all is that they feel threatened now because we started in April last year. Many political parties were laughing. They were saying we only campaign in the suburbs, we won't get a single seat, we are not going to do well, we're going to fail. And then they saw the convention that we had in October, and then the whispering started. And then the first registration weekend in November last year, we decided to put the little resources we had into postering because people don't know about us. So we put people into postering. The ironic thing is that also last year, I think it was, the EFF put up the 10th anniversary at FNB. Those kind of events of that size do not cost you less than 60 million, right? So a political party that has massive resources, that can spend that kind of money in one day, is complaining about a small new political party because they finally managed to afford posters. But they actually can't afford to hold a big stadium event. I told you how many supporters we have. If we needed to fill a venue of 10,000 people, we could. We don't have that kind of money. So we have to choose where our money goes. And we put our money in postering because people need to know that you exist before they support you. Otherwise, we get our money exclusively from South Africans. No governments at all. Unlike the EFF, which is partly funded by the government, as all represented political parties are, we don't get a cent from government.
Are there any maybe external Western investors in Europe or the US maybe?
No. I mean, you're not allowed to take funds from non-South Africans, even when they are in South Africa, by the way. You can't. So if somebody from Germany who's resident in South Africa, has got business interests in South Africa, wanted to help us with funding, legally they can't. It's not allowed. So it's just someone who's just, being a habitual liar, as he does, when there's an issue that upsets him. Otherwise, no.
In terms of entering the political space, you need thick skin. You come from the private sector and you also come from the media space. Do these comments, these attacks on you, in any way scathe you?
No. So in my language, isiXhosa, there is a term where we say zikhonkotha ehambayo. That means dogs only bark at a moving car. Now, when dogs aren't barking, well, you're not moving. Once they do, and I'm using this metaphorically, once they do, you know you're doing something right. And no, in fact, those comments have been very helpful to us. Between Fikile Mbalula and Julius, they have boosted our name recognition significantly, more than we could have ever paid for. Because they are obviously very popular figures. People who didn't know about us say, who is this political party? And then they find out about us and then they like us. In fact, I want them to say more about us during the campaign so that more people can find out about us.
Guys, you're still sitting with the Citizens Podcast Movement. Click, like, share, follow us. Tell many people about this podcast. Now, Mr. Zibi, in terms of demographics, is your party mixed in terms of all demographics of South Africa, whites, blacks, Indians? Do you have people living with disabilities in your movement?
Oh, yeah. Look, I mean, one of the things we set out to do as a fresh start is that we need to have diversity in all sorts of ways: race, age, gender, different levels of physical ability among South Africans. That was very important to us, that we have, for instance, in our leadership team, we've got people in their 70s, but we also have a 21-year-old in the same leadership collective. That's been very important to set that as a culture. And when we release our candidates list, you will also see a similar mix, where some candidates are like 62, 63, because you need the experience, and most candidates are under 40, and some candidates are in their 20s, in their mid-20s.
And speaking about this candidate list, many people are releasing theirs, while some are being leaked. But who are we likely to see on your candidate list? Of course, you're number one.
No, look, I mean, you can expect to see most people on our National Leadership Collective. You also most likely to see some people you know already because they've done some great things in public service. But we've really focused on building for the future. You will see a lot of candidates who are first time, who are in their 30s, who are in their 20s. This is very important because by 2029, those people will have 5 years experience under their belt. They will still be under 40, and you will begin to see the young, energetic leaders, where in future South Africa could have a president who is 43, 44 years old. That's what you want, but you build from within. You can't just, grab people from thin air.
There's a maybe a debate or perhaps suggestion among people that perhaps Action SA, Rise Mzansi, and people like Bongani Baloyi should come together and form one political party instead of being fragmented, or maybe Sarah as well. What is your view of that?
No, I've got total sympathy with that. But I think we've got to understand a couple of things, and people forget these things, right? Let me give you a very practical example. People think because you're all black, you necessarily share the same vision of politics, right? Not necessarily. Let me give you an idea. We've had as the most controversial issue now the issue of Gaza and Palestine, right? Action SA and other political parties, let's say, who for their message have been criticized heavily, right? We've been criticized by some, but we've generally taken a progressive view on the issue. Now, my question is, so what happens now? You are together, right? You are now not agreeing on some fundamental issues. That's one example. The second example is an issue like immigration, for instance. Okay? We don't believe in demonizing immigrants. So what do you do when you encounter this problem? I can make many examples, like defunding public education. So what I'm trying to say is, I understand the sentiment that people think because you have a black skin, you necessarily belong together. I really understand, but I think it's important that we are disciplined in believing in a certain type of politics and then getting together with others on the basis of that politics. And that's what we're busy doing with several other smaller political parties, by the way, just trying to build a strong coalition.
Do you mind mentioning who those are, maybe?
No, those will come out in the coming days and weeks because those conversations are ongoing, but they are generally local level type political parties. And when I talk about a coalition, I mean a broad coalition, not a governing coalition. Just, the ANC's coalition includes COSATU, SACP, etc., etc. Yeah, so it's important to build a coalition like that as well on the basis of the politics that you've constructed.
Right now, since we've gotten into policies, what are the maybe 5 core policies that Rise Mzansi is offering that perhaps could change the face of South Africa?
Look, the most important, we've spoken about leadership. Intumeleng leadership is very important. People will often say, yeah, but how is your idea different from the ANC or the DA? It does not need to be different, right? When there is only 1 or 2 ways of doing something, and the party that is in power is not doing it right, it means the people they've got in government are not making the right decisions. And therefore, they need to get out of government so that you can have people who who will make the right decisions. Let me make a very simple example, right? We've only now had a chief executive at ESCOM. Andre de Ruyter left a long time ago, right? The finance director has been acting as chief executive, which means you had an acting finance director and an acting chief executive for nearly a year, if not a year. Now, that's not a policy problem. It's a leadership problem. You either want to appoint a chief executive or you don't. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Right? And so that's very important. The second and last example I want to make is, as you know, you are in the news business. What is the biggest conversation about the parliamentary list right now? It's whether the ANC is going to put tainted people on its list. Right?
Yeah.
You see the problem. Now somebody says to me, how is your idea different? Like, dude, the problem we have right now is that we have the wrong people in government. So that's important as an issue. The second thing is, as a principle, is that we tend to target problems, not broad policy areas. So we've tended to go for food, as an example, right? South Africans are hungry. If you don't say food, you're always just going to say jobs only, but people need all manner of support to improve food security, to put food on the table. They can't even look for work if they don't have enough food and so on. So that's priority number 2, I would say. And not that it's less important than leadership, but priority number 2. The third, I'll mention 2 more. The third is that we've built our manifesto around well-being of the individual, the family, and the community. So all of these service delivery issues that we often talk about, whether it is jobs, it is provision of water, electricity, other basic services and so on, community infrastructure, daycare facilities, etc., etc. All of this is built around the well-being of the family and the community. Because service delivery is never to one person specifically. It's to an entire community. So we've got an integrated approach in which there's about 10, 12 policy areas within, including spatial planning, public transport, job creation, skills development, etc. And then the last one I want to make an example of is climate change. We were talking just now with one of your colleagues about how hot it has been.
Of course.
Right. It's not just the heat. It's also the fact that in my village where I come from, the maize is dead now. Right? People are not going to be able to harvest any maize, which goes back to our priority number 1, which is priority number 2, which is food. You understand? It affects food security. So one of the things we're trying to do is we're trying to change the climate change conversation in South Africa to be about basic existential issues rather than a broad policy areas and so on. Look, I could go on and on, but let me stop here so not to give you a very long answer.
Of course. Well, one thing that people have recognized, though, about Rise Mzansi is that you seem to have a lot of competent people. And, you know, you're just communicated now that management of a country is quite important. The people that you put there, the skills that you put there, how you appoint them and how they govern. You know, what would you say these young people, you know, that you bring to the fore will offer to South Africa?
So, you know, today, as you and I speak now, I think in a few minutes' time, we will be announcing our premier candidate for the Western Cape. His name is Axolile Notywala. He's in our National Leadership Collective. Axolile studied, I think, mechanical engineering at CPUT. He's worked in civil society all of his life. He's been on many civil society leadership roles. He is very thoughtful. You know, he doesn't speak often, but when he speaks, his contribution is enormous. Here's why we do that. You want people with diverse experiences. Vuiswa, a Gauteng Premiership candidate, comes from business sector, right? Black business associations, her own businesses and so on. Nonkululuke Hlongwane Mhlongo in KZN, also a brilliant young person. She's also in her 30s. She's got a diverse background, also in civil society, working with communities and so on, passionate about democracy and service delivery. Axolile Notywala, social justice activist of many, many years standing, etc., etc. So what you can see here is that we're not saying in order to be competent, you need to come from business.
Yeah.
Necessarily. We're saying South Africa is rich with talent, with young people who are not celebrities, who can do the work. We must get into the habit of recognizing people for their talents, and that's what we're doing.
Sure. And, the other issue, of course, is something that's happening currently in the news. The DA writing to the U.S. Secretary of State, asking them for intervention in our elections. Now, I think it's quite appropriate to ask because you've been accused of being a puppet of the West.
Yeah.
What do you think about this?
No, South Africa is a very strong civil society. Very strong civil society. We also have a High Court, a Supreme Court of Appeal, and a Constitutional Court that have got very good judges therein. And I was part of civil society organizations before we started Rise Mzansi. And I know there is a big conversation there about how to ensure that the election is free and fair. I think the DA needs to give South Africans credit. If there is any rigging that's taking place, it's really at the level of funding, right, where the established political parties are getting lots of government money. I mean, the minister allocated 200 million, defunded the IEC by 200 million, gave 200 million to political parties. Over 120 million of that is going to the ANC, right? If you talk about rigging, it's those kind of things. But at the ballot, if anybody wanted to rig the election, South Africans would fight like hell, I must tell you. We don't need other governments here to interfere. If there's an election that needs international monitors, it's the U.S. elections, actually.
Of course. Any particular reason why?
I mean, look, there is just so much gerrymandering in the U.S., which is, what is it called? Voter suppression.
Yeah.
In the U.S., where, the districts are changed all the time to ensure that, a certain political party always wins, So if you ask me, if any country needs international observers, it's the
So this puts me to a thought that, maybe corruption is not only in Africa. Maybe Africa is not the only place where you find corruption.
No.
You can find corruption in the U.S. too.
Listen, there is lots of corruption in the U.S., by the way. There is lots of corruption in the U.S. I think the point is this. I mean, for instance, in the U.S., generally, media publications are very well supported financially. I mean, they've got pretty much the same struggles. But, there was that story with Donald Trump trying to pressurize the Secretary of State in Georgia to rig the election for him. We ended up with that tape in the New York Times and in the Washington Post, right? So you gets exposed. The people that took part in that attack on the U.S. Congress have been, the police searched for them, they found them, they prosecuted them, they were put in jail, some have come out already. That thing happened in 2021, right?
Yeah.
In South Africa, how many of the guys who took part in the riots have been sentenced, for instance? Or people who took part in corruption, zip. And that's the problem of corruption in South Africa and Africa, I guess, right? It's a lot of it we don't get to know about it. When journalists expose it, party supporters attack them. Otherwise, no, there's lots of corruption there. Ooh.
And you yourself have fallen criticism for accepting money from Rebecca Oppenheimer. Of course, you know that, the Oppenheimer family, quite a famous family in this country, but, the EFF has really attributed their contribution as being part of land theft, part of being, dictating how South African politics should go. And, they've sort of deemed them as having the economy of the country in their hands. Do you think that you shouldn't have taken that money? What do you think?
No, they're mad. They are mad. Actually, if she could afford to give us more, we would have taken it. And this is the reason. I can't think of a better way. I mean, there are many other ways, right? And she's got charity. She makes charitable donations in many ways, right? But South Africa is in trouble right now. There are certain people with money in South Africa. Julius is suggesting that they should not help us to get South Africa fixed so that the EFF can remain a dominant force on its own. the only emerging force in South Africa. That's madness. Somebody like Rebecca Oppenheimer makes her own decisions about where to deploy the money. She does not interfere in what we're doing. We only sent the manifesto, our manifesto, by the way, around the 22nd of January. We launched the manifesto on the 20th of January, right? And we've got the kind of relationship with her as a donor as well as other donors, right? There are donors that we've rejected.
Can you say a few names? If you
No,
could?
but I mean, I can't put them in the news because you know what I mean. So I can't. I mean, those who eventually donate over 100,000 get known and people can talk to them. You know?
Yeah.
But we rejected because, you know, if you say this on this policy and if you say that on that policy, then I will support you. And we say no. Sorry. We would be having television ads right now, which we can't afford, if we had accepted those kind of demands. We'd be able to place TV ads, radio ads.
So what's the biggest amount you've rejected?
Let me say cumulatively, from all the conversations that were not successful because of political and other demands, it's tens of millions. Oh no, it's tens of millions. It would make a significant difference in our campaign. But the problem is once you start that relationship where someone gives you money, and that's what the EFF and them are familiar with, by the way. Someone gives you money, they say, then you must do this for me. If you start now, when you get into government, you can't say no, it's too late. You have to say no from the beginning. You have to say no, even if it means you get 10 seats instead of 30.
Now, the other thing is that dysfunctional coalitions in municipalities. Does RISE have a particular view of how these coalitions should be run? Johannesburg is a complete mess. Ekurhuleni is a complete mess.
Yeah.
Pretoria is starting to stabilize a bit, but also under the radar. What do you think the solution is to these coalition arrangements?
You know, the solution goes back to new leaders again, as we keep saying. Like I said, you know, at Rise Mzansi, I must tell you, if there is a political party you've never heard of that has won votes, they're not ideologically similar to us. However, they are willing to not try and get their way with everything. Because when you're in a coalition, you say, here's my top 5, bring me your top 5 priorities. And if, say, there are 3 or 4 of you, here are our top 5 priorities. Let's make sure the top 3 for everybody is addressed. If we do that, we can have a coalition government because it means you will address 70-80% of voters' concerns. And then when the next election comes, we fight again, you know, like for voter support. But it's not personal, don't hate each other. What happens with these coalitions is that the fight is usually about positions. Who becomes speaker? Who becomes MMC? Who becomes this? You know why? Because there was an election coming. The people want to control those positions so that they can influence which contractors get the money, and those contractors
Need to fund their party.
Yeah. That's what it's about. So you need leaders such as the people we have where it is possible, even if it hurts. And I must tell you, having had these tough conversations hurts our campaign. It does, because we don't take money just from anybody. And people with their money, they've got their own conditions, so I don't blame them. But we also have a choice of whether we take that money or not. Now, somebody that has given you money says, if you guys are not on the mayoral committee, then you can't help MIMOS after. You see?
So another thing, Mr. Zibi, is the economy. The economy is going to be a big factor when it comes to these elections. The EFF is, campaigning with it. MK is campaigning about the economy. The ANC is saying we're going to implement our policies on the economy. People are saying something went wrong with the talks about the economy at CODESA. What is your view as RISE on the economy?
So let's talk about what's wrong with the economy and how to fix it. The things that are wrong with the economy are not necessarily in the economy itself. They're outside the economy. Number one is politics, right? Eskom and Transnet are choking the South African economy, right? Eskom is not producing enough electricity, doesn't have enough money, owes too much, no management, and so on. Fix that problem, and you begin to see a difference. Transnet, we can't move goods in and out of the country as much as we should. Because Transnet, again, operational problems, no leadership, owes too much money, pays a billion rand a month to service debt, and so on. Again, second number 2. Number 3, you know what it is? Municipalities. The 3 metros that you spoke about are responsible for most of our economy, right? Now, if you don't sort out the metros, the governance in the metros, you can't go anywhere. But it's true of municipalities around the country as well. Many of them, they are misgoverned. And yet every business is in a municipality. So we're saying fix municipalities, number 2. Number 4, fix crime. Nobody wants to open a business in a place such as where I come from in the Eastern Cape. A small business, not like a rich investor no. A person who could open a car wash or sell chickens, they're afraid they're going to get shot. And now what does the ANC characterize that? They say there's an investment strike. When you are scared, you're not on an investment strike, right? So that's the 4th thing. And the 5th and last thing that we are saying is that we need to convert the provident and pension funds from which we borrow into investors in our SOCs. So currently, the government issues bonds, and the pension funds and so the asset managers buy government bonds. And we pay a 10%, 10, 11% interest. Now we can do this differently, which is to say, guys, okay, how about you become investors in public infrastructure and SOCs, but in exchange for that, you can nominate people to the board, have oversight over how the money is used, and you only get paid when this begins to turn a profit. Now you don't have to pay the 10% interest because they've got skin in the game, they're interested. Because our problem now is we've run out of money. The government is technically bankrupt. Now, parties have a long shopping list with what money?
And Mrs. Zibi, does Rise have a particular view on the provinces? Do you think they should be reduced? Do you think that we have a lot of MPs that need to be shrinked? Do you think we don't need deputy ministers? Do you think the administration should be somehow altered?
Look, we had the discussion at the convention about provinces, but we didn't include it in the manifesto because we don't believe it's the most important. The general view then appeared to be that you don't need provinces, right? But it's a discussion that we're going to have. What is absolutely clear is that number 1 priority, have competent ministers. Number 2, reduce the number of ministries. It's not necessary to have a ministry of electricity simply because you've destroyed
ESCOM.
Like, okay, just put competent people at ESCOM. And then you have a ministry of small business. Do you know why we don't have enough small businesses? The money that should support them was stolen. There is crime so that people can't start businesses. We don't offer them enough mentoring and support and help them to get cheap loans from financial institutions and so on. So what do? You have a minister of small business who's never had a small business, let alone successfully, and the deputy is a trade unionist.
And where are the grants going? We hear that the small business grants, but where are they going?
The problem is, and this is no insult on people. So when I started at Rise, right, it was important that we get some people who know politics around us. And so we have someone like Makashule Ghana, for instance. He's a seasoned politician, he's young like us, he believes in the things that we've done, but you've got someone next to you who's done this, who can guide you. We don't provide that opportunity to emerging businesses. So they get money and they spend it in good faith, but there's no help with mentoring and training and so on. And those businesses fail and that money is gone. Now, we're saying that we need to provide entrepreneurial training support to especially young people in South Africa so that when they get that money, the business flies.
And perhaps one of my last few questions on the issue of BEE, there's still a sentiment that there is still a gap between white South Africa, black South Africa, rich South Africa, and poor South Africa.
Yes.
Does Rise have a particular view on this?
Oh, yeah, this is a fact. This is a fact. If you are a white South African, you are less likely to be poor than an Indian, colored, or black African, South African, right? That's just a fact of life. What we're saying, though, is that in doing BEE, let us not just look after people like me. In other words, you've been in the corporate sector, you can get into a BEE deal, or employment equity, all of those are important. Employment equity, diversity and inclusion in the workplace, very, very, very important, right? And we've just spoken about financing and so on. But it's important that we also see black economic empowerment as providing people with the tools to be empowered. Now, what we've just spoken about now, providing training to entrepreneurs, most of whom would be black and so on, is to make sure that they can get into the ring. We are leaving too many people outside the economy. And then we talk about BEE because a few of us can eat. So our approach to BEE is basically from both ends. From the bottom, make sure that people get a good education, good training, entrepreneurial training, support, and so on. Finally, we're also saying, let us focus the use of government support on 100% BEE companies, not 2%. But otherwise, the company is 98% white-owned, or it's 80. No.
Then it doesn't achieve its goal.
100%. Let's take Intumeleng Incorporated, owned 100% by Intumeleng, and his business partners who are colored, or the majority of them are at least black in the broad sense, by the way, not to say in the broad definition of blackness in South Africa. Right? Sure. Let's support those more.
Sure. Guys, you're still with Songeza Zibi, the leader of Rise Mzansi. As we're wrapping up, Mr. Zibi, what's your view on land? And give us perhaps a view of what you think the elections would come out as. Do you see a victory for yourself?
No, thank you. On land, quickly, we believe that we are simply not doing spatial planning and justice properly. So there is a lot of landlessness as a result. Let me give you an example. We know South Africa is urbanizing fast. But the government is always surprised and is not allocating land ahead of time so that when people get to urban areas, they don't become unlawful inhabitants of land. So we're creating a landlessness problem where none should exist. One of the instruments that is available for a public purpose is expropriation. Right? It gets done all the time to build a dam, a mine, Gautrain, whatever. Yeah. Transnet, Eskom pylons, etc. It gets done all the time. We're saying the reason they're not using that instrument is because there's no special planning. They don't know where to get land and for what purpose. So Rise Mzansi's manifesto provides for the whole thing to say, know what you're going to do with land, know where it's needed, and then you can use lawful expropriation where it's necessary.
So we shouldn't follow the example of Zimbabwe?
No. Why would you do that? Zimbabweans are here. The same South Africans who were cheering what Mugabe was doing are now hating on Zimbabweans that are here. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Right, people, you can't do these things irresponsibly. You must know why you need land. Is it for farming? Is it for... And so that you don't compromise yourself and destroy farmland. Then we're not able to feed ourselves. Right? And then now we have to be told by the IMF what to do with our policies here. This is what happens when you take irresponsible decisions. Final thing on the election. Listen, we would be very happy if we got 20 seats in Parliament. We would be very happy. We're a new political organization. We are building for the future. We want to show that it's possible. If we get those 20 seats, we potentially can be part of a coalition government so that the excellent people that we have can show South Africans what is possible when you've got the right people. Otherwise, even if we're not part of a coalition government, our people can do the work in committees and in the National Assembly to deliver on what South Africans have given them as a mandate. We don't have to be in government.